Record. Okay, everybody. We are, of course, now midway through the holiday of Passover, Pesach, and as I failed to mention the Sfirat HaOmer, so I want to start with that this evening, and then we're going to do a rapid review of Jewish history. Some 1,500 years in less than 2 hours, something like that. All right, first of all, the Torah says in Mimocharat Shabbat, the day after Shabbat, that we're supposed to count 50 days, and then the 50th day will be the holiday of Shavuot. Now, it is very clearly ambiguous when it says Tispru Miyom Shabbat, that you count after the Shabbat. And so we know that there were differences of opinions as to when the count began. All right. So now, one straightforward reading of it would be the day after the Shabbat would mean that you start counting the omer on a Sunday. Saturday night would be the first day of the omer every year. And therefore, that means the holiday of Shavuot would move back and forth vis-a-vis the time between Passover and Shavuot. But you still would have a counting of 50 days, but the 50 days beginning with Sunday and ending on Sunday. The rabbis understood it differently. There's another understanding is that the first Shabbat after Passover is over. All right, and once Passover is finished and is done, then you would start counting the omer from the day after the Sabbath, again on Saturday night, Mimocharat Shabbat. Jewish tradition, though, accepted the opinion that the word Shabbat can also mean a holiday. Sometimes the holidays are referred to as a Shabbat. And since they're referred to as a Shabbat, then you would have the circumstance of counting the day after the first day of Passover. And so that indeed is the practice that we follow. Starting the night after the first day of Passover, which this year was Saturday night. And then each night from then on, we count the omer. Now, the Bible describes the idea that the omer was actually a measure of grain that was harvested and brought to the temple in Jerusalem. And then that served as the permission, once it was made into loaves of bread and brought before the altar, for the Jewish people to be able to eat this year's harvest of wheat. Up until then, you had to use wheat that had been harvested the previous year, but you could not eat wheat that had been just now harvested. So that was the allowance from the idea of the omer. So now, each night we count after sunset, after stars come out ideally, but at least after sunset, and we count the days and the weeks. First night of the omer, you say, Yom Echad La Omer. Tonight is 1 day to the omer, 2 days the omer, 3 days the omer. After the 6th day, we say the 7th day of the omer, which is 1 week. Then the 8th day of the omer, which is 1 week, 1 week and 1 day, etc. So that we count both the days and the weeks. Usually, like I said, it's usually done in the synagogue right after services, at the evening service, assuming it's the service is late enough. But in any case, it's supposed to be done after sunset. It's a mitzvah on everyone to do so, to count the omer. So when we count the omer beforehand, we say a bracha, Baruch atah Hashem, Elokeinu melech haolam, asher kiddushan mitzvotav v'tzivanu al sfirat haomer, for the mitzvah of counting the omer. If you miss a day, or you miss counting it at night, you can count all the next day until sunset. If you miss counting the entire day, then you are still supposed to keep counting, but you can't say the bracha any longer. All right, so that's the origin of the Sfirat Omer. Now, in addition to that, we have developed at some time in history an understanding that this was a period of semi-mourning. There's a late midrash, it's actually not found in the Talmud, that says that this period of time was a time when the students of Rabbi Akiva were killed. This is presumably during the Bar Kokhba revolt period. And that let up, or something which made a change in things, occurred on the 33rd day of that counting. The 30th day of the counting in Hebrew, Lamed Gimel, which is the letters for 33, Lamed being 30, Gimel being 3, so that's 33. And that became known as Lag BaOmer, the 33rd day of the Omer. So that figures in a number of different ways. We have to understand it. Because this was regarded as a time when the students of Rabbi Akiva were dying, we observed certain level of mourning. We don't have weddings. We don't sing and dance. A more somber attitude. Don't get haircuts during that time. Don't cut our beards, etc. Now, with this idea of Lag BaOmer, probably what we had was the original custom seems to have been you counted the first 33 days, and the 33rd day was a kind of a semi-holiday. People got haircuts. They ended the mourning period, and they then went on counting the Omer, but not observing the restrictions that were in place until Lag BaOmer. Now, two other customs developed. One was counting it starting after the holiday is over, and counting the 33 days from then up to 3 days before Shavuot, and then having it like kind of a break for Lag BaOmer. Different customs, different places. During the medieval period, and we will talk about that tonight, this was a period of time also in which there are a number of massacres, attacks on Jewish communities in medieval Europe. And so that seems to have influenced the idea of counting the Omer starting a little bit later and making it a much more stricter idea of a time of mourning. If you go to different conservative synagogues, there are different practices in the conservative world. Some observe until Lag BaOmer. Some will observe only the very beginning, to Rosh Chodesh or to Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Memorial Day. Some don't observe it at all, any restrictions. So again, this is one of those things that you talk to your sponsoring rabbi as to how she feels the Omer period should be observed. Okay. Right. I'm going to share with you a chart, and I will again send it out. It's okay after this class. Give us kind of an overview of what we want to look at Jewish history, the medieval period up until the early modern period. Now, we always have to remember that Jews lived in different lands, and the experience of the Jewish community in different places was different. And certainly when we look at the medieval period, we very clearly see there was a difference for most of that time between the world that was under the control of Islam and the world that was under control of Christianity. For the most part, the Islamic rule was relatively benign. And Jews and Christians both were seen as legitimate religious beliefs to a certain extent, but not up to the par of Islam. Jesus was regarded as a prophet for Islam. Jews being under the course from the Torah and being the first of the monotheistic faiths, and indeed in many ways was closer to Islam than Christianity was. But so if we kind of take a quick glance at the Eastern world, the Arabic world this time. So Muhammad lived around the year 570 to 632 of the Common Era. And in 638, the Muslims had conquered Jerusalem. And by the mid-8th century, the entire Mediterranean basin was under Islam. And the home of the majority of the Jews, which was Spain. And we're talking about 711, they conquered Spain. As I said, Muslim rule was generally benign. There was generally not an attempt to forcibly convert Jews or Christians. They were dhimmis, they were second-class citizens, but there was no forced conversion. And many Jews and Christians, because of the favorable conditions for Muslims, did convert to Islam during this period of time. The dominant language of the Mediterranean basin became Arabic. And that was the language of scholarship at that period. And indeed, it was the Muslims who translated the ancient Greek philosophical texts, especially those of Plato and Aristotle, and began the study of them. And that influenced Judaism very much. In the Islamic world, Jews were very much involved with the culture of their locations. So the culture was one in which science, and science generally meant philosophy, was at a pinnacle in the ideas of the intellectuals. And sometimes that creates a conflict between accepted religions and Greek philosophy. We will talk more about philosophy at a different time in general, but it's clear that it was the Islamic Arabic translations of the classics that became part and parcel of a large part of the Jewish community at this time in terms of intellectual study alongside Jewish texts. And for example, you have Sa'adi Gaon, it says in the chart, 882 to 942. He was one of the Gaonim. The Gaonim were the heads of the academies in what had been Babylonia. Now we're talking about Persia. And he was a noted philosopher, and Maimonides and others as well. Some Jews served as courtiers. Sometimes the term court Jew was used, especially in Europe, Christian Europe. For example, Chastai ibn Shaprut, who died around 1056, was a courtier. He served in the heads of the where he lived, the local king. He encouraged Jewish poetry. The Muslims had a very clear culture of poetry, and so we find Jews were doing the same thing. Some of that poetry was not religious poetry, but love poetry, all kinds of things that sometimes bothered some of the rabbis. Another famous individual, Shmuel Hanagi, in 993 through 1055, not a scholar, a courtier. He was even served as a general leading a Muslim army in Muslim Spain. Right? So in the year 1146, there was a major rupture in this golden age of Spain. The Almohads was a fanatical Islamic sect, came up out of North Africa. They conquered Spain, and they persecuted Jews and Christians, sought to outlaw both Judaism and Christianity. Indeed, Maimonides fled from the Almohadic rule. There's questions whether or not he pretended to be a Muslim for a period of time. Many Jews were forcibly converted to Islam, and there's a famous letter that he writes, Maimonides writes, defending the honor of those Jews who accepted Islam under force. He introduces his letter by noting that there was one rabbinic scholar who condemned the Jews who had converted. Not only that, he said they could not return to Judaism. They could not do teshuvah. They couldn't repent. And Maimonides takes him to task and seeks, first of all, to downplay the meaning of what Jews had done. He says it's merely words. They weren't really worshiping idols. They weren't worshiping false gods. They merely made a statement by force that there's no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet, chief prophet. So at this period of time finally does come to an end, and we enter into what is known as the golden age of Spanish Jewry. And like I say, Maimonides kind of overlaps that period of time. And he was indeed one of the most important figures of Jewry in the Middle Ages. The years of his life, 1135 through 1204. He's known for the Mishnah Torah. The Mishnah Torah was a codification of Talmudic law. We had that, we talked about that when we talked about Jewish law, rabbinic literature. He also famously wrote was the Guide of the Perplexed, the Guide for the Perplexed, Moreh Nevuchim in Hebrew. The Mishnah Torah was written in Hebrew, a beautiful Hebrew. His Guide of the Perplexed was written in Arabic. And it was originally a letter that he sent to a student who was bothered by what he saw as a conflict between essentially Aristotelian philosophy and rabbinic tradition. And Maimonides sought to deal with that, to integrate the two so that they were not at loggerheads with each other. Maimonides favored the study of philosophy, and they thought that by explaining Judaism as really a kind of a philosophy itself, he would enable Jews to participate in philosophical studies and still remain loyal to Judaism. But and it was a very rational vision of Judaism that he stressed. Now, maybe this would be better. Okay. No, it's not. There. Okay. So anyway, he was opposed by some in the Jewish community. and especially in parts of France. And as a result of disputes over Maimonides, some of his books were burned in 1232 by some of these rabbis, and that perhaps served as an introduction to book burning, so that in Christian Europe in 1242, a large number of Jewish texts, the Talmud especially, and other Jewish texts, were burned in Paris. Now, while this, and as the anti-rationalist or anti-philosophical movement in Judaism became more and more important, we begin to see the emergence of a counterforce, more of a mystical approach to Judaism, namely the Kabbalah, as it was first expressed in this early period. And so this idea of a more mystical vision of Judaism, one that was more concerned with not a more acceptance of the traditional text, because Maimonides accepted the traditional text, but he had a tendency to find a rational explanation for items in the Torah. For example, he was not adverse to saying that the purpose of sacrifices was to wean Jews away from idolatry. And one of his later opponents, another Moses ben Nachmanides, 1194-1270, took him to task for that. And he explained a different way of seeing the mitzvah of sacrifices as atonement for the person and in place of his own life that should be slaughtered. And he often, in his biblical commentary, refers to mystical ideas that were coming to the forefront at this time. Going back a little bit to Judah Halevi, and again, when we look at philosophy, we'll look more at Halevi. That's in May. In a work called the Kuzari, Yehuda Halevi takes an anti-philosophical approach to Judaism. And while he was not directly responding to Maimonides, as Nachmanides sometimes was, he certainly was very down on the study of philosophy. And later on, in late medieval period and the early modern period, his work, the Kuzari, becomes a much more important text than the Guide of the Perplexed and More Nevuchim of Maimonides, especially in today, even in the yeshiva world, they're more likely to study Halevi's Kuzari than they are to study Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed. And so finally, this struggle ends with a complete ban on the study of philosophy. Solomon ibn Adret, who was a student of Nachmanides, issues a ban on the study of philosophy that was accepted in many quarters. Okay. Now, the story of Judaism in the Muslim world was one, for the most part, as I said earlier on, relatively congenial relationship. Certainly, as I said, Jews were not on an equal basis with Muslims, but they, for the most of the time, were not persecuted, and Jews very much participated in the intellectual life around them. This was a very different experience in Christian Europe. The Jewish community really in Christian Europe, this period of time, the Middle Ages, was concentrated in France and in Germany. And what we call Ashkenazic Jewry has its origins there. And so we find one of a number of great sages that of Ashkenazic Jewry, for example, Rabbi Gershom Me'or HaGolah, Rabbeinu Gershom, who dies around 1040. He was his school was a school that Rashi later on was educated in, meaning the school of thought. He's most famous for Takanot Rabbeinu Gershom. These were the Takanot, amongst other things, banned polygamy for European Jewry. Now, of course, the most famous individual of this group, of the earlier sages, was Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo ben Isaac, also called Shlomo Yitzchaki, son of Isaac, 1040 to 1105. Again, we're talking about France and Germany, southern Germany is where he was. And he, of course, is the famous commentator for both the Torah and the Talmud. No one studies the Torah, at least in traditional Jewish circles, no one would study the Torah without consulting Rashi's commentary or studying the Talmud without consulting his commentary. And as we noted when we talked about rabbinic literature, his was a word by word or line by line commentary, both on Talmud and on the Torah. And his students, starting with his sons-in-laws and later students, the Tosafos, the Rashbam, Rabbi Shmuel ben Meir, who was Rashi's grandson, Rabbi Yitzchak Meir, Yitzchak Tam, Rabbeinu Tam, another grandson, were the Tosafos. They sought to deal with contradictions in various parts of the Talmud, tried to smooth over rough edges that might be there, and they too are part of the traditional Talmudic study till today. But we know that the Christian vision of Judaism was extremely negative. Don't forget, Jews were accused of being the killers of Jesus, as in the New Testament. They were seen as cursed to wander the world. They were not regarded as really citizens of the lands in which they lived. They had no rights to own landed property. They were often banned from some professions. And as time went on, they were more and more banned from various professions until money lending was one of the few areas in which they could earn a livelihood, mainly because Christians would not lend money to each other on interest, at least not in the early medieval period. And so Jews served as that go-between, the money lenders of that era. Problem with that, of course, is, when you need to borrow money, the Jew is your friend. When you need to pay the money back, you're not so friendly. And since Europe was really broken up into smaller segments than we have today, especially in Germany, and even under one king, the local authorities, the local barons, or various whatever level of medieval authority they had a great deal of control over their lands. And so Jews were allowed into these areas under their permission to live there. And so they were given permission to live in a community, and that permission could be withdrawn. And that happened many times. During the course of the Middle Ages, Jews would be welcome to an area, and then they might be expelled from that area. And anti-Semitism, or really Christian anti-Judaism, ruled the roost. It's important to acknowledge that this is different from modern anti-Semitism. Modern anti-Semitism is at least in theory, a racial construct. Jews constitute a race. Individuals who are born Jewish are part of that race and cannot escape it. That's why when we talk about World War II and during the Holocaust, even Jews who were nuns or clergy in the various Christian faiths were sent to the concentration camps. The Jew during this time did have an out if they chose to convert to Christianity. Generally, they were accepted. There still might be issues, but they had a way of escaping this kind of critique. And sometimes, as we'll see when we talk about Christian Spain, they rose as to be very important members of the Christian society. You know, the First Crusade, 1096, right, and was devastating to a lot of Jews. We don't always know exactly the full measure of what happened in terms of the amount of death and destruction that took place in the Jewish communities. Jewish sources tend to magnify the losses, and some modern scholars tend to downplay them. It doesn't matter but Jewish communities were attacked, Jews were killed, Jews were forcibly converted to Christianity, and once you're a Christian, you could not escape being a Christian. And it was during this period of time that some Jews were prepared to sacrifice their lives rather than to convert to Christianity. And there are a number of episodes in which Jews killed their children and themselves rather than submit to the Christian forced conversion. And there were a number of accusations that were laid against Jews. The Blood Libel, mentioned that I think we did talk about a little bit, but Blood Libel was the idea that Jews would kill Christian children and use their blood to make matzahs. This appears in a number of places, and in Canterbury Tales, which used to be something you had to study, one of the Canterbury Tales is indeed one of these Blood Libel stories. So if any child was missing, the first thing they did was they accused Jews of having killed the child. They were accused of stealing the consecrated host for their own purposes. Since Christians believed that during the rituals of Christianity, the hosts, the wafers became the body of Jesus. Therefore, they could be the Jews could torture to get blood from the host. I mean, Jews didn't believe in that at all, so which was nonsensical. But nonetheless, that was the claim. They were accused of usury, which of course was the case. Jews lent money at interest rates, and the interest rates were very high, and they put pressure to get the money back. That was the way you did things in those days. Like I said, when you wanted to borrow money, they're your friends. When you want to pay it back, or they want you to pay it back, goodbye. And a number of times, the various local authorities, whatever they were, the count or the duke or whatever level of authority they had, would borrow money from Jews to take care of their expenses. And then when the Jews wanted the money back, they kicked them out. And so they didn't have to pay back their loans. Jews were accused of poisoning wells during the time of the Black Death. There was a rumor that Jews had poisoned the wells, thus causing the death. According to something I read recently, there seems to have been, as a result of some kind of genetic reality, something of a greater Jewish resistance to the Black Death. genetically, and so the Jews didn't suffer as much, and that opened the door to say, "Wow, you are poisoning us, and you are escaping." So, from various times, there were attempts to destroy Jews. Jews were kicked out of one place or another. Slowly, they made their way east to hand washing. I saw that Ren says that, but there's some who disagree on that, Ren, that whether or not the hand washing really made a difference. But because the cause of Black Death was from flea bites, and the fleas came from the rats, and the rats were throughout the towns and the cities. So washing your hands would not necessarily prevent that from taking place. But it's it was perhaps a little bit part of it. I was reading recently, as I said, didn't seem to take that into much of a have any terrible weight in the difference in sickness amongst the Jewish community and the non-Jewish communities. Right? So Europe was a hodgepodge of circumstances. Jews lived in different communities. They were beginning to make their way more eastward. The migration was towards the east, towards eventually into Poland. We're getting a little bit later on. And they were expelled from all of France at one time. They had been expelled from all of England. And so that was part and parcel of the Jewish life. Now, when we go back to Spain, we begin to see also a change. The Reconquista. The Reconquista was the attempt by the Christian authorities to conquer Muslim Spain and restore it to a Christian world. And slowly but surely, that indeed was taking place in the 1300s, 1400s. Finally, in 1492, the last Muslim holdouts were conquered by Ferdinand and Isabella, and thus removing Muslim rule from Spain. Now, leading up to this, we find that there was a heavy pressure in the Christian areas to get Jews to convert. And there were a number of debates that took place, not just in Spain, but particularly in Spain. Moses Maimonides, indeed, was one of those who was forced and had to take part in one of these famous debates. Usually the debates were between rabbinic authorities and the church authorities, and they often had Jews who had converted to Christianity would serve as the debater on the Christian side. They were conversant, at least to some extent, with Jewish ideas, and therefore they tried to use those Jewish concepts, Talmudic ideas, and statements in the Talmud against their Jewish interlocutors. Now, I remember I pointed out that in 1242 the Talmud had been burned. All right, that's because by that period of time, the Christian authorities understood that it was the Talmud that ruled Jewish life. The Christians knew that Jews had the Torah, the Bible. They shared that common Bible, at least the quote Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures. And they thought that Jews just misinterpreted the scriptures. But they began to understand that it was more than that there was a whole Jewish tradition, as elucidated in the Talmud and other works, that Jews referred to and used as guidance for their lives. And that's why the Talmud and other books were burned in the 1200s, because they understood that it was not simply the Bible, but rabbinic tradition as expressed in the Talmud that was their enemy. And so these Jewish Christian debates sometimes ended up with burning of the Talmud or other Jewish texts. Now, we have to also understand, especially now we're in Muslim Spain, Christian Spain, there was great effort put out to convert Jews to Christianity. And for various reasons, some Jews accepted that and converted. Some were converted by force. And this meant that you had Jews who were living as Jews, you had Jews who were living as Christians, and you had some Jews who were living outwardly as Christians, but inwardly and in secret, they practiced Judaism. And they became known by the name of Marranos, which was really a negative statement, and meant, and yet we usually refer to them today by that, or conversos. Now, one of the problems that we begin to see is that, like I said earlier, you could convert to Christianity and save your life. But some of the converts were not really very well educated in Christian practices. And many of their Jewish practices that were part and parcel of their lives, they maintained. And that made them suspect to the church authorities. They didn't eat pork. They didn't want to work on Saturday, on Shabbos, and other kinds of things. Sometimes it was done purely innocently. You know, they were not trying to negate Christianity. They were not trying to turn away from it. They just didn't know any differently. As I said, there were some, though, who for various reasons had converted, but they indeed wanted to maintain their Jewish identity. And we know that up until the modern era, and even till today, there are descendants of these Marranos, especially in North America, South America, who still maintain some small Jewish practices, which show that they were originally Jewish, but over the course of time, most of that Jewish background disappeared from their lives. But since they were understood to be Christians, Christians were not allowed to practice another religion. And anytime these conversos, these new Christians, did anything that looked like they were trying to practice Judaism, they now became subject to the Inquisition. The Inquisition, we have to understand, was really not directed at practicing Jews. The Inquisition only had technical authority over Christians. But, you know, it was often the fact that a number of these conversos, these new Christians, had money that they were allowed to keep. They had relations, Jewish relations, that had not converted, and they were in contact with them. And so they might be accused by someone in the Christian community of practicing Judaism in secret, thus being subject to torture by the Inquisition to confess. You know, and almost all of them did end up confessing. After all, how much torture can you take before you say, yes, I'm guilty, and everybody else is guilty, and all that sort of thing, and then often burned at the stake. And so you had this problem that the Christians saw, And so Ferdinand and Isabella were convinced to expel the Jews from Spain, figuring that if they expelled the Jews, they would then eliminate those who might influence these new Christians to turn back away from Christianity. And so in 1492, Jews were expelled from Spain. It took another 10 years before they were expelled. They were expelled from Portugal. In the case of Spain, many Jews left. Some did stay behind and converted. Some converted outwardly but maintained Judaism secretly. And as I said, some left, some converted, quote, legitimately, and others practiced Judaism secretly. But that proved that was the end of the Jewish relationship in Spain up until the modern era. Jews could not live in Spain up until relatively recent in history. And that wiped out hundreds and hundreds of years of Jewish life in Spain. So now we as we get into the later medieval period, we begin to introduce a new reality, and that was the ghetto. Now, since Jews wanted to live near the synagogue, and since Jews in general preferred to live together, it was not unknown for there to be Jewish quarters. But in Venice, on 29th of March, 1516, all Jews who wanted to live in Venice were forced to live in a certain area, which became known as the ghetto. It was meant to minimize social contacts, yet to retain the economic advantage of Jewish presence. Jews were active in the money trade. Jews were active in commerce. Because of Jews throughout the Mediterranean, they sometimes had the capacity to have contacts throughout the world, and that made for advantages in commerce. Now, this concentration and isolation provide Jews themselves with security and protection from the outside forces. So, it served a dual purpose. The gates were locked at night. Jews were not allowed to be outside. But by locking the gates, we were able to protect the Jews that lived inside the ghetto. And so this idea spread to different quarters throughout Europe. And this is a period of time in which Jews were involved in commerce and trade. And as I said, there was a beginning of a movement towards Eastern Europe. The Kingdom of Poland, founded in 1025, and then to the early years of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was created in 1569, Poland was the most tolerant country in Europe. Known as Paradisius Judaeorum, Latin for Paradise of the Jews, became a shelter from persecuted and expelled European Jewish communities, and the home to the world's largest Jewish community at the time. And some sources said about 3/4 of the world Jews lived in Poland by the middle of the 16th century. Western Poland had been devastated over time, and so there was a need for settlement of people to come in. A lot of Germans came in. That, of course, later on causes its own problems. But Jews, along with the Germans in general, made their way into Poland. And we find that this community, as I said, becomes the basis for a good part of the Jewish world, even up till today, and of course was destroyed by the Nazis during the Holocaust. All right, so by 1570, we have the Shulchan Aruch being printed. Joseph Caro, we mentioned this when we talked about rabbinic texts. One of the explanations for the widespread of the Talmud, of the Shulchan Aruch was because of the creation of the printing press, and it was able to be published relatively cheaply and became available to everybody. So this was 1570. However, in 1648, we have what are known as the Chameniki massacres. Right now, we're seeing a very disturbing war going on in Ukraine. Khamenei is a hero in the Ukrainian vision of history, but for Jews, he was a catastrophe. He led the Kazakhs who were attacking the Polish overlords. Jews were often middlemen between the peasants, who tended to be Eastern Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, and the Roman Catholic Poles. And so you get caught in the middle, you're going to suffer. And again, many communities are destroyed, raped, pillaged. Numbers are hard to ascertain accurately, but it was a very devastating period of time. One of the ironies was that many people thought that this was going to be the time of the coming of the Messiah. Right? And we'll get back to that in just a couple of minutes. All right, so now, I mentioned the idea of Kabbalah in Muslim Spain. At the end of the medieval period, we find a very upsurge in mysticism. The Zohar, the core book of the mystics, becomes popularized, and a number of important sages were involved in formatting Kabbalah as we know it today. One of the most important being Isaac ben Solomon Luria, the Arizal, was born in 1534 and died in 1572. Didn't live very long, but an important influence in the rise of Kabbalah. This, of course, was in Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, but it spread quickly through both the Sephardic and the Ashkenazic worlds. It also gave rise to a very strong messianic impulse in the Jewish community. Many of the sages who were involved, all of the sages, almost all the sages that were involved in the reinvigoration of the mystical tradition were of Spanish Jewish heritage, either having lived through the expulsion. Some of the really not this in 1492, so it's not that long ago, and that has impact on the mystical traditions. And the hope of that this suffering that they were going through was the introduction of the coming of the Messiah. So you have again, like I say, we will talk about it more. You have a philosophical kind of mysticism. There's a different name used for it, I forget it at the moment. But it was an intellectual practice and understanding. And then you had practical Kabbalah, which was on borders on and reaches to the magical. The idea, and a lot of folk ideas enter into this, of dibbuks being spirits that take hold of somebody, and golems, the idea of being able to create a life from clay. So you have this upsurge of the mystical tradition. You have a upsurge of messianic hopes. You have difficulties of the such as the Khamenei massacres, and that gave rise to one of the most important false messiahs period, that of Shabtai Tzvi, and then later Jacob Frank. Shabtai Tzvi dies in 1676, and Nathan of Gaza was his prophet, his Elijah. So we know that Shabtai Tzvi was seen as being the Messiah. His followers thought he was the Messiah. He gained great popularity. Many people believed indeed that he was the Messiah. People sold their homes. They prepared to go to the land of Israel. Shabtai Tzvi began to also perform certain actions that were were a violation of traditional Jewish law, and that has effect, as I'll explain in a minute. But he ends up going to Turkey. He's in Turkey, and he is arrested by the Caliph, and he is given a choice between death or conversion to Islam. And so Shabtai Tzvi converts to Islam, and that, of course, destroys his place in the minds of many of the Jewish community, not everybody. Some of his followers felt that what he was doing was part and parcel of a Kabbalistic notion that it's in order to free all of the fallen sparks, the netzitzot, those divine sparks that were created when something went wrong with the creation of the world, that were in the depths, and it was up to the Mashiach, the Messiah, to descend to those depths in order to free those netzitzot, those divine sparks. So it was the concept of sinning for the purpose of mitzvah, sinning in order to perform a worthy act. So some said, well, that was the role of the Mashiach, the Messiah, not anybody else. Others said, no, we have to emulate the Mashiach. We have to emulate Shabtai Tzvi. And in Turkey, they became part of a community known as the Donme. And up until the modern era, there were still some around, and they were converted to Islam, but they practiced Judaism in secret. They only married amongst themselves, and they felt that they were followers of Shabtai Tzvi. Now, in Europe, there was another individual known by the name of Jacob Frank. And Jacob Frank was a bit of an oddball, and he really was a charismatic figure, just as Shabtai Tzvi was. And he, in some way, somehow convinced people also that they had to follow Shabtai Tzvi in his descending to the depths into sin, holy sin. And, usually if you want to attack a sect that's come into being, you always accuse them of being sexually improper, doing things like, wife swapping or things like that. In the case of Jacob Frank, apparently it was true, and that they were practitioners of some very unsavory actions, and they had a relatively small group around him, and this was in Austria. Now, there were weapons in the Jewish community. Rabbis and Jewish communities had the control over halakha, the Jewish interpretation of Jewish law. They often were the judges, and they dealt with all kinds of issues that came up, business issues, etc. And in order to enforce it, they had the power of cherem. Cherem was to say that an individual who did not obey the ruling of the court, the Beit Din, was expelled from the community. Jews would have nothing to do with them. They would not bury them. They would not circumcise their children. They would not have business dealings with them. And sometimes that coercion was sufficient to keep control over the Jewish community. Sometimes it wasn't. One famous episode was that of the famous Baruch de Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza. Spinoza, born in 1632 and died in 1677. His Hebrew name is Baruch, and later became known as Benedict, because Benedict is the Latin for Baruch, for blessing. He was a Dutch philosopher of Sephardi and Portuguese origin, and he was an important philosopher laying the groundwork for 18th century Enlightenment and modern biblical criticism. He indeed becomes one of the important figures in creating the Enlightenment. He introduces scientific interpretation of the Bible. He questions the divine authorship of it. His religious visions is a pantheistic one, not so much an individual personal God, but God as being part of the universe. He emphasized the preeminence of the intellect. And as a result of this and other things, the Jewish community in Amsterdam felt threatened by him, and he was excommunicated. He was put into cherem, which there was just recently a whole to-do in Amsterdam. There's this place called the Spanish Portuguese Synagogue, very beautiful synagogue. It still looks like it did at the time of Spinoza. They still use wax candles for lighting. And there was a gentleman, I think he's from it, I believe he was an Israeli scholar, but I won't swear it, who's doing some research on Spinoza. He's written about Spinoza, and he wanted to check with some things in the synagogue there in their library, and the rabbi there refused to allow him to do so, and he cited the excommunication of Spinoza, and the lay leadership of the synagogue were aghast, and then they countermanded his order not to let him to come in. So it still has impact in today. All right, so let's move back east to areas of the Ukraine and Belarusia, White Russia today, etc. This was the territory in which the Hasidim came into being. Israel ben Eliezer, known as the Baal Shem Tov, was the founder of Hasidism, also called the Besht. So we're saying 1698 to 1760. So it's interesting. Look, here in Europe, in Western Europe, right? Spinoza is born in 1632. 50 years later, an exact opposite view of the world comes into being with the teachings of the Besht. Essentially, well, Hasidut has a number of important elements that he emphasized and still remain in certain parts of the Hasidic world. To best understand it is, and again, we'll go in more detail later on, is that first of all, that God can be served through joy as well as through study. You didn't have to be a great Talmud scholar to be considered a righteous person. The role of leadership was put in the hands of charismatic individuals known as a tzaddik or the Rebbe, and they were the go-between between the ordinary Pashut Yid, the simple Jew, and God. And so their role becomes much magnified in the everyday life of their followers. And since they are on this high level, their followers are like a king. So like a king, they should have fancy homes, fancy carriages, all kinds of things, which meant they had got lots of money. And some of them were certainly very honest and sincere individuals. Some of them later on were not so honest and sincere. Another thing that was important in the Hasidic movement was emphasis on emotion in prayer, that how you prayed was as much important as what you prayed. And one of the famous stories that is found in various formats, I'll just give one version of it, is that it was Yom Kippur in the synagogue, and the Besht, or one of the other Hasidic Rebbes, was praying, and he felt that the prayers were going nowhere. They were stuck in this shul. They couldn't get out through the roof. And then this poor boy comes in. He hasn't much of a Jewish education. He can't even read. He just knows the alphabet. And so one version of this story is he says in a prayer to God, God, I can't read the prayer book. I know the alphabet. I'll recite the alphabet, and you will put the words together. And so he starts doing that out loud, and the people hear it. They're all upset. They shush him. And the hero of the story turns to everybody and says, stop, let him be. Our prayers were stuck here until this youngster, in all sincerity, started to pray by saying the alphabet. His sincere prayer, his emotional prayer, opened the doors of heaven to everybody else's prayer. And so eventually there were various Hasidic groups, different rabbis from different communities, rabbis, bringing a plethora of the various Hasidic dynasties. Now, at the same time, again, we have these interesting overlaps. In Vilnius, we have Elijah ben Solomon Zalman, the Gaon of Vilna, or the Vilna Gaon. The Gra, as he's also referred to, born in 1720 and dies in 1797, was one of these outstanding minds that come along every few centuries. Brilliant man, a brilliant scholar of the Talmud and of all Jewish knowledge. Also knowledgeable in Kabbalah, mystical traditions. He emphasized the intellect. He emphasized the study, that was most important, more than important than anything else. So he goes that he would learn late at night, and even sometimes if he got tired, he would have a bucket of cold water, which he would put his feet into to keep him awake so he could study all night long. And the community, even though he wasn't a popularizer, he didn't have big synagogue. He didn't go out and speak to the masses, but he was so well respected that the community of Vilna gave him a stipend for him to sit and learn. And his students who came after him would publish some of his works. He never published anything. They published works based upon his teachings, and thus he became extremely influential. He really introduced an almost modern critical approach to Talmudic study. He was very concerned with variant readings of the text. He was very concerned in getting into the exact meaning of various texts. He was opposed to just relying on the traditional interpretation of others. You had to examine, see what the text had to say. He was opposed to the Hasidic movement. He at least was used as a voice against the Hasidim, who certainly were not in line with his approach. And there's all kinds of stories, some claiming that some Hasidim danced on his grave, that sort of thing, that was apocryphal, but nonetheless, it expresses the kind of antipathy that existed between the mitnagdim or the misnagdim, the opponents of the Hasidic movement, and the Hasidim themselves. All right. So we're moving now from the medieval period into the early modern period. I don't know what happened here. I'll worry about it later. The emancipation. So in 1654, there was a boatload of Jews coming from Brazil. Brazil had been under the rule of the Portuguese, and as a result of one of the wars that took place at that time, the Dutch took over Brazil, when the Dutch, who had a much more tolerant vision of religion and people practicing different religious approaches, the Jews who had been secretly practicing Judaism in Brazil openly practiced their Judaism. They're allowed to practice freely. And when then Portugal regains control of Brazil, these Jews felt threatened, and they left and land in New Amsterdam, also known as New York. So the first Jewish settlement in North America was that of these Spanish Portuguese Jews, who eventually founded the Spanish Portuguese synagogue. And the earliest participation of Jews in Northern America was under the Sephardic banner. 1656, Jews are permitted to settle in England. And around this time begins what is called the Haskalah, which parallels European Enlightenment. It was an attempt to see the world in a more logical, more open vision of things. And it was more scientific, more historically oriented. So, for example, you have Moses Mendelssohn, who demonstrates how Jews can be part of the general European culture and still remain loyal to the essentials of their faith. And he sought to introduce some minor changes in Judaism. And eventually, though, we see that it was a very difficult task that he set for himself, and indeed all of his grandchildren ended up converting to Christianity. Now, along comes the French Revolution, and you have a decree in France of a complete emancipation for Jews. Jews would have civil equality. Now, that was based upon the idea that individual Jews could be citizens of France. Until this time, there was the Jew was not a citizen. You had the Jewish community. The Jewish community had rights, and you had paid taxes for the community. Now the individual Jew is to be severed from that relationship and becomes a French citizen, which was good for Jews in a certain extent. They could participate with others in whatever level was allowed at the time of voting and things like that. But it also severed the power of the Jewish community to maintain structure and order in the Jewish community. And it began, and we begin to see some of the corrosive elements of that, in which Jews began to move away from Judaism. And Napoleon pushed the same kind of a thing later on, opening the doors more and more. Now, while you, at least in theory, could be part of the the general community, even though you're Jewish. It was very clear that there were limits to what you could do. And conversion to Christianity was a real key to opening the door for Jewish involvement full-fledged. Some Jews converted because they couldn't get a professorship at a university without converting. Some Jews converted because they found themselves to be more acceptable if they had that nomenclature, that ticket, as Karl Marx said, entrance to European society. And so we had that going on. At the same time, we had the creation of what was known as Wissenschaft des Judentums, the science of Judaism. Leopold Zunz and others sought to study Judaism the same way that any other culture was studied. And it meant moving away from the traditional understanding of Jewish development. It meant saying that Judaism does develop, Judaism has a history. It is not all of one what's the word I'm looking for? Well, it doesn't come straight from heaven, let's put it that way. It has history. It is influenced by things around. And they sought to show that this indeed was the reality. Now, part of the reaction to this so-called scientific Judaism was Reform Judaism, a modern orthodoxy, Hirsch, and etc. When we talk about Judaism and forms of Judaism, we'll talk about them more. Now, while Western Europe was reacting to the voices of modernity, Eastern Europe was not. The Jews under Tsarist Russia suffered. Russia, Poland ceased to exist by 1789. It was conquered, part was taken by Germany, part was taken by, I think, the Swedes, in part by Russia. Russia had no Jews in the homeland of Russia, but all of a sudden, when they get these territories from Poland and Ukraine, they have a lot of Jews there. So they set up what's known as the Pale of Settlement. And that was certain areas where Jews were allowed to live, but nowhere else. And there were various decrees forcing Jews out of whatever trades, except from very money lending and pawnbrokering, that kind of thing. There were orders that Jews had a quota of conscripts to the army. And when you were conscripted to the Tsar's army, that was a 25-year conscription. And it meant the death of the Jewish aspect of the individual. When there was difficulties, one way of relieving the pressure in the public was to organize pogroms. You blame the Jews for everything. And that lets the steam off. Instead of attacking the government, they attacked the Jews, and numerous times this happened. And the result of that and various other things, you end up having the beginning of a large exodus from Russia to North America, especially to the United States, other parts of Europe and Canada, but especially to the United States in the 1880s and 90s. And then we get into Zionism. We're going to stop at this point. Okay. So I know that it's just kind of a various wide overview of what was that history's about. You certainly there's some reading I signed for you in the sheet to give you more greater detail. Sometimes when we read Jewish histories, up until the modern era, there was this, what modern scholars call the lachrymose history, always tears. Jews were always suffering. Well, the fact of the matter is there were more times that Jews were not suffering than they were suffering. There were large periods in which Jews did relatively well and lived relatively comfortably. But we see that there was a tension that always existed between Jewish identity and local identities. And Jews maintained their distinctiveness by language and practice and religion. That meant often that there was not much in the way of intermarriage. Although when one looks around at the Jewish communities, one sees evidence that there are genes who come from somewhere else in the Jewish community. Jews from of North African descent tend to look more Arabic, for lack of a better term, which is probably more what Jews looked like back in the Roman period. The Jews in Europe certainly often have more European features than the Jews from North Africa. But in the main, there was a clear distinction that was kept between Jew and Gentile on both sides. Jews wanted to remain distinct. Christians and Muslims often had suspicions of Jews and wanted nothing to do with them unless they were prepared to convert. But as we get into the modern period, we see more and more Jews entering into the society as a whole. 19th century begins that process till we have to today, where Jews are very much in part and parcel of the various societies in which they live and have distinctions more or less depending upon their approach to the world around them. Okay, any questions? I know it's covered a lot of ground, not in that thick and that wide. But you can see, I think, the broad parameters of the Jewish story. And that's what I have in mind here. The number of books you can read on each period of history is monumental. Okay. All right. We will finish Pesach this week. And next week, we will continue. And we'll go to April 20th, up to the Holocaust. April 27th, we'll talk about the run up to the Holocaust and the Holocaust. Okay. Anything out there? Any bricks to throw?
Yeah.
Yes, Robert.
No, I was just putting on mute, that's all.
Oh, you were on mute. You just took off mute. Okay.
Yeah, right.
All righty. All right, everybody. Have a good weekend. I hope the rest of your Pesach you survive without too many problems. The matzah shouldn't be too bad for you. And all the best. Okay.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Oh, well, just quick question. Passover ends Saturday
night.
Okay, like an hour after.
And just like when Shabbat ends, Passover ends. Wait a little while after that for the rabbi who sold your chametz to buy it back, and then you can put your house back together. Okay?
Okay.
All right. We spend the whole night almost doing that. Okay. Good night, everybody.